I am just constitutionally immune to this kind of contagion. And therefore, I have felt left out of multiple social manias. I found it privately disturbing, but I did not write about it. I was intimidated. I did not write about it until 2016. You know, the whole growth of cancel culture started with trans. And because that's what got your head cut off. It's so conformist. It's being sold to kids as brave, but it's not brave. It's imitative. It is allowing the freakish, obsessions of your era to tempt you into mutilating your body and even foreclosing the possibility of having children, and in many cases making it so that you never really have an orgasm.
Lionel Shriver, you're very welcome to the podcast. I'd hoped you would speak in the Gensbeck conference in Lisbon, and we had you all set, and then you got this awful illness, which my husband had also got 10 years previously, and you weren't able. So then we got you back for this instead. And I'm kind of thrilled because we're going to get a chance to get deep into what I feel like is a very important moment in the kind of contemporary living right now. You published 17 books. I've read loads of them and I loved them. Particularly loved So Much for That. And I love Big Brother. That image of that guy at the end of the book in Big Brother with the frosted sugar around his mouth and he was putting on the weight. It broke my heart. Great, brilliant book. There's so many books, and everybody will know you for We Need to Talk About Kevin, and you won the Orange Prize for that. So you're very welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on. And I'd be very interested in what your thoughts are. The inauguration of Donald Trump was just a couple of days ago, and your latest book, Mania, was an extraordinary analysis of the kind of DEI madness that has kind of unfolded over the last 10 years. It feels like really good timing to have you on right now.
I think it is good timing. I should add that I was myself very disappointed to not be able to speak in Lisbon, and I now live just outside of Lisbon, so it was really great timing, almost. And I had hoped to share some thoughts about the whole phenomenon of transgenderism and how disturbing this mania had become. And I think that the phenomenon of suddenly the trans thing exploding in seemingly overnight, I'd probably pinpoint about 2012 when it really started taking off. That's really in some ways, the inspiration for the novel Mania, which I released last spring. I decided I wanted to write a book about the phenomenon of social manias itself rather than write about one in particular. So I made up my own. So in my alternative 2011, just deliberately right before the transgender thing started taking off, it suddenly becomes a social gospel that there's no such thing as variable human intelligence, that everyone is equally smart. And rather than become fanatically sensitized about race, everyone is fanatically sensitized about stupidity and the fact that there's no such thing. And therefore, it becomes with all kinds of speech codes, which I had a lot of fun with. But what made that an appropriate stand-in for a whole sequence of manias that I've observed in the last decade or so is that it is in defiance of biological reality. And so is transgenderism. So they have a lot in common. And it was my intention in writing that novel to examine why it is that we have a tendency as a group to basically go insane, and to believe things that are in defiance of what we have understood up until 5 minutes ago. And then suddenly we're fervent believers in something that we would have found preposterous earlier in our lives. And yet, because everyone else believes it, we believe it too. And I've always been someone who is, I guess this sounds boastful, but I can't help it. I am just constitutionally immune to this kind of contagion. And therefore, I have felt left out of multiple social manias. And it's a lonely business. And I think, Stella, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, very much. I think you do it well in the book. The woman who stands up against cognitive equality, and she could be called a cognitive supremacist or a cerebral
supremacist.
You know, it's very interesting because I've often wanted to do an analysis of the personality of the gender critical person. Why did some people speak up? And as you say in the book, it's not intelligence. There is a certain kind of personality that just can't abide a pervasive dishonesty around them. They have to speak up. What it is about that person, but thank God they exist. But it's a lonely road.
Yeah,
it's a horrible road, actually.
And reliably, once the mania is over, everyone pretends that they weren't into it.
Oh, so what's?
I'm convinced that once this whole woke thing is finally over, you're never going to find anybody who claims that, that was me.
The trouble with that is we have the receipts because all of our interactions take place on social media via written communication. It's going to be much harder for people to deny. But what do you think it is about you then that makes you immune?
Again, at the risk of sounding vain, I am used to thinking for myself. Now, I read lots of opinion pieces and everything from a range of people, and so it's not that I don't have inputs, and I am still a social creature. And accordingly, it has been a relief as time has gone on during the last 10 years to feel that I have some companionship intellectually and politically. I think I'm pig-headed. I've been called contrary. I don't think I'm a contrarian exactly. I think a contrarian is someone who reflexively and perversely disagrees with you in an oppositional sense. It's not really a thoughtful position necessarily. So I don't latch on to that label. But I don't like being bullied. And I think that's a lot of it. I wasn't a very popular kid. I was a weirdo. And, eventually the weirdos rule the world. Ask Elon. But it's not apparent when you're a kid you're going to rule the world. And I hate being told what to do. I hate being told what I have to say. I hate being told what kind of language I use. Because after all, I'm a writer, and those are the building blocks of my profession. And I have felt bullied from all sides for the last decade. And I think one of the things that's most interesting to me about the transgender thing is how this came on not only so suddenly, but in tandem with a very clear instruction that if you disagree with this, if you say, this is a little warped, you're going to be your career is over. You're going to be destroyed. And this was such a strong and effective message that even though, me with all my vanity about being an independent thinker, and I, at least behind closed doors, found the trend of this new fascination. Suddenly it was all over documentary television. I found it privately disturbing, but I did not write about it. I was intimidated. I did not write about it until 2016, which was earlier than most people. And I knew I was taking a big risk. I wrote an essay for Prospect magazine, and I questioned whether basically the soul has a gender. And I was one of the first people to observe that this whole movement was based on gender stereotypes. And by the way, I'm breaking my own rules because I hate the word gender and I try never to use it. But and I was pointing out that alone in a room, I don't feel especially female. And I don't think of myself as female. I'm not saying that I'm a man, but my sense of myself is not sexed. And when my experience of myself as female is purely social. So I don't pretend I'm not female around other people, but in my own head, I'm not a woman. I don't and I don't cling to an identity of being a woman. And I had got a very strong response to that, especially from other women who also felt the same way about. I find that sensation of not, your very self not having a sex is more common to women than men. But the men I really like, my friends, feel the same way because they're a certain kind of man. And one of the most regressive things about this movement has been this business of making the sex you were born so utterly central to who you are. And I reject that. And I've rejected that since I was a kid. I was a reluctant girl. I grew up between two brothers. We played with trucks and trains in the dirt. I was an honorary boy. And I did not like wearing lace and hated wearing dresses, etc. So this making sex an identity really bothered me. I found that even the use of the word identity has been, it's changed over my lifetime. We talked about having an identity when I was an adolescent. We were very absorbed with our identity. But what we really meant was what bands we listened to, what authors we liked, what we wanted to be when we grew up. It was all about building a sense of self. And it didn't have to do with race. It certainly didn't have to do with sex or sexual preference. None of that stuff. It was your tastes and the people you liked and the movies that you watched several times, And, I read Catch-22 ritually on my birthday for 8 years in a row, only to grow up and discover that it's actually a very disappointing book, but that's another subject.
Could I ask, there's something you said about your childhood which reminded me. You changed your name.
Yes.
And an awful lot of parents take great issue, and they take great issue with their children taking their name. I work a lot with parents of trans-identified kids, and they understandably take great issue with their kid changing their name because it's rejecting their name to propose a new identity that they really live in. But it's very interesting that you did this way before it was popular or profitable, as the saying goes. And you changed it to a boy's name. What was that? How did that go down? You were very young. Were you 12? I read somewhere you were 12
I
and
was
somewhere else you were
15.
15.
I'd
Yeah,
always
15.
hated my given name. I mean, I took my first alias when I was 8. It was the wrong name for me, and I was christened Margaret, and actually it was Margaret Ann. So my family called me Margaret Ann, which is I don't know, slightly hicky tradition. um, I just felt very strongly from an early age that it was not my name. It just wasn't the right name. And I took Lionel shortly after we moved to cities. I was living in Raleigh, North Carolina. We moved to Atlanta. And this was my opportunity to change my name for good. So it was just filling out an ID name tag. And I wrote Lionel instead of Margaret. And I stuck with it religiously. And it worked. And I never meant to insult or disappoint my parents. And I was sorry to learn after the fact that my mother, whose name is Peggy, took offense. That is, she was hurt, which is more concerning than someone who takes offense. I didn't, because Margaret is what Peggy is derived from, and I hadn't really understood that I was named after her in a way. And well, she's dead now, but I hope we cleared that up eventually.
This is going to be a really obvious question. I think I already know the answer, but do you see that if you were young today, you would be trans? You'd have fallen into it?
No, I wouldn't.
Oh, you don't think?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it is true that even the choosing of the male name was a suggestion of that interior sense of androgyny and a sense of also of separation from traditional femininity. I wasn't really into being female. And even in my latter career, I have not written very much about feminist topics. I'm not interested, honestly. And I don't go on and on about, how people are not nice to women and all our terrible special problems. Doesn't interest me. Rather talk about immigration. So I had an aspiration to live a large life, and to me, identifying very powerfully with a sex was limiting, and especially if it's identifying as being female. And I even in fiction, one of the things that's thrilling about fiction is that is before cultural appropriation came along. You can be anybody, and I've written a lot from a male point of view, and it enlarges my world. It's exhilarating. And I just finished a new book, and my protagonist is a 26-year-old man, and he's way over 6 feet. Yay! I am 5'2". So yeah, that's what I have always aspired to. I mean, in a kind of expansiveness, and I feel that we're growing up in a time of limitation. Now, why I would not have been tempted by trans, as long as I'm still the same person, is that it's so conformist. It's being sold to kids as brave, but it's not brave. It's imitative. It is allowing the freakish, obsessions of your era to tempt you into mutilating your body and even foreclosing the possibility of having children, and in many cases, making it so that you never really have an orgasm. I mean, this is awful. And I think even if it, it was be 15-year-old me, I think I'd see that pretty clearly. I think as a 15-year-old, where I would get myself into trouble is finding these my fellow classmates who are all suddenly coming to school and saying, I've decided I was born in the wrong body, and just getting really tired of it and refusing to get on board and not wanting to use their preferred pronouns. I mean, I think that's what would have happened. I'd get myself into terrible trouble. I'd be kicked out of school because I would be making fun of these kids who actually do, I'm sorry, but a lot of these people, they make themselves ridiculous. And we're supposed, and I resent the imposition on me, then I'm not supposed to observe that, right? When you see someone walking down the street and you can see they're trying to pass as the other sex, they look absurd, and you're not supposed to stare, much less, or even if you're with other people, unless they're your best friends and you can say transgressive things, you don't even say anything. You don't, you're not allowed to express ridicule. But this is inviting ridicule. The whole thing is ridiculous. It is ridiculous. And it's also, and I think this is underplayed, it's a terrible waste of time and resources and energy. It's a waste of social energy. We have enough men and women already. We don't need to go swapsies. It doesn't work. It's expensive. It's painful. It's destructive, and it's stupid. Okay? It's a stupid social project to have people try, or at least pretend to change sex. And it's a waste of their lives. It's a waste of social capital, and it's a waste of individual capital. And I think in some ways maybe the most dangerous thing that I plan to say in September when I missed that appearance was, one of the things I'm a little tired of in the pushback against trans is, there's this standard disclaimer. It's not that I have anything against trans people. I fully support their civil rights, and I have great respect for them. No, I don't have great respect for them. I don't. You have become infected with a virus that you should have been immune to, and you should have been able to spot this for what it was. And why have you allowed yourself to be tempted into making yourself ridiculous and wasting your life? All those doctor's appointments, all those drugs, all that medicalization of your life from this time forward, it's a waste. And you could be doing something interesting. It's not interesting. It's not even interesting anymore. It's been going on long enough. And we've those of us who have been pushing back have even started to exhaust the arguments against it. I mean, there's plenty of evidence out there that this is doing a great deal more harm than good. Little good. I don't see any good. So I hear you, but sorry. Go ahead.
There is something to say, though. There is a point to push on here, which is, like, I retain my evil eye for the doctors and the clinicians who are paid and put into positions when somebody's at their most vulnerable. When you're sick, whether it's in the mind or in the body, you're at your most vulnerable. You go to the doctor, and those doctors are supposed to look after you. And those doctors are allowing these awful medical interventions that will not work, that cause awful pain. They're paid, they go through 7 years of medical school, they're paid to be in a position that they should be given better guidance. While somebody who's kind of lost their mind a little bit and has got caught up in something, I kind of think we can all go a bit mad in different ways. But the idea of society is we've set up a society that your teacher will look after you, your counselor will look after you, your psychotherapist will look after you, your doctor will look after you. You know, that's how we've set up society. And in fairness, they're the villains of the piece.
Oh, definitely. When I'm dissing trans people, which is what I was doing, it is, I'm not sympathetic with that, but it's not vilification. Okay, that's a different thing. You are a sucker. You have fallen for a false answer to your problems. You know, it doesn't mean I'm not sympathetic with the problems, but this, you know, you have gone down the wrong path. And of course, one of the reasons that so many young people have gone down that path are because of all the people you're talking about, the grown-ups who should know better. And of course, it is their fault. It's totally their fault. And there should be real legal repercussions for, I mean, and not just the doctors, even the therapists who have been in league with the doctors and the teachers and the teachers' unions and pushing this ideology. I mean, this implicates a lot of people. And yes, I mean, I don't mind your calling me out on that, because those are the villains of this scenario. And they're making money on it. And they can't be that delusional, can they? That they think they're doing God's work somehow. I don't actually know any of these physicians.
I'm convinced. This is honestly is one of my most unpopular opinions amongst my own side, if I have a side, is when I say that I really do believe that they are true believers, that they're not, you know, doing it out of malice to hurt people. They actually really are true believers in a completely insane ideological belief system, and that they do believe that they're helping these, like, I've spent so much time thinking about WPATH and all of these doctors, and I really do think that they're not setting out to harm, but they're doing terrible harm. Just quickly, in defense of you know, the social contagion kids. We've seen so many social contagions. Kids just fall into these things, and particularly the power of this idea, like you're saying, it's being bombarded in schools, it's being bombarded in the media, it's everywhere in society. So I think there's nothing particularly gullible about these kids that they got swept up in this particular idea, this social contagion. I think it's just really bad luck to be coming of age and to be vulnerable at this time. The adults, I have less, the fully mature, the middle-aged man who's, you know, succumbing to his autogynephilia in middle age, I have less sympathy for him. And what I don't know if I should say this, so we might cut it out, but when you're saying about the ridicule side of it, my best friend, my oldest and dearest friend, is a lesbian. And way back in the 1990s, we used to go to the gay village in Manchester. To the lesbian, there's a very clear divide. There were lesbian bars and gay bars. And on Wednesday night was what they called tranny night. And her friends specifically went out on tranny night to make fun of the men who were in the lesbian bars, because they were ridiculous. They were men dressed as women, clonking around in their heels in lesbian bars. And it was ridiculous because they were invading the lesbian spaces. So I think there is some justification for ridicule in that situation.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if we didn't have to take this so seriously, then you could just have cross-dressers in a lesbian bar, and it would be funny, and everyone could find it funny. I mean, that's one of the things that's oppressive about this movement, especially the way it came in, as I talked about, that you could not say a discouraging word about the sudden popularity of both the subject and the phenomenon.
And do you think
But it's so oppressively serious.
Do you think that came with trends, or was the groundwork laid before that, you being ruined for the wrong idea, for wrong think? Did that start with trends or before?
I can't really say, but it's certainly, the whole growth of cancel culture started with trans. And because that's what got your head cut off. Absolutely.
Well,
and I don't
it's
have
very
that.
interesting when you look at the comedians and you think, like, in the court of Henry VIII, in medieval courts, we had jesters. There was always people allowed to make jokes. And then suddenly in the 21st century, jokes became forbidden and all sorts of words you couldn't say. And humor, which is my favorite thing, got risky, if you follow me. There's so many jokes that aren't allowed. That felt a profound imposition on me. It's part of my life. You know what I mean? Messing around with different wordplay, accents, just different words. Like it's a fundamental part of what keeps me happy in life. And not being able to make jokes. And that's why I actually thought the comedians would lead the revolution, and so did Graham Linehan, evidently. And he tried to, and nobody fell in behind him. It was unbelievable that the idea you put jokes. Yeah,
Dave Chappelle broke the rules and made jokes about trans people. Now, I would submit he can only get away with it because he's black. If Dave Chappelle were white, he would have been ruined. But he's black and he's funny, and it's the combination.
And did they accuse? Sorry.
Yeah, go.
Didn't they accuse him of it was his whiteness that was causing him to make fun of trans people? There was some accusation of him being white.
Oh, I didn't hear about that.
But that's a key point, because I've been thinking a lot about DEI in the last few years. I used to just think about trans, and I've really expanded it off into the DEI. And I think you're right. You've just written a book about immigration. And, I think it's a really important point to raise that it's an overall, like when you look at the LA fires, and I couldn't help but think of your book, Lionel, of Mania, where at the end of the book, nobody could do anything. The surgeons weren't able to carry out surgery because they'd been basically DEI'd into it. You know what I mean? Anybody could get any position. And, there's an awful lot of stuff coming out about the LA fires and how there was a lot of DEI hires not able to do their jobs. And that's what you get when you kind of start thinking it's all about identity rather than ability. I do think there's a really important point to be made, but it pisses me off, and I think it will piss all three of us off, that it's suddenly become right-wing to think that ability is important.
Yeah, and I read believing in meritocracy is right-wing.
Yeah. Joe Rogan said believing in, keeping fish is right-wing as well. But I read that you said you were a lifelong Democrat in 2022, which I found extraordinary, and you voted Joe Biden. Oh, go on, spill.
Not my proudest moment. Yeah, I mean, I actually, Biden, I came to loathe him in a way that I've never felt that way about Trump. I've never voted for Trump. So, I'm not a Trumpster. I'm not a big fan of his. But Biden massively betrayed me. I felt personally betrayed. I mean, from day one. And, it becomes more and more obvious as the truth leaks out about about what kind of shape he was in, that the Biden whole agenda was being controlled by a set of pretty fanatically progressive aides who stayed in the background and designed all the policies and clearly came up with the appointments. But I mean, from the start, all the staff positions, the cabinet, everyone was chosen in terms of identity, and so it was continually announced. Oh, this is the first, Indian American. This is the first, and nobody ever talked about whether they were qualified. It was completely beside the point. In fact, it was utterly irrelevant. And he, he betrayed me on transgenderism. He was a big, men and women's sports guy. So, actually the last 4 years have been horrific for me. And I'm not proud of this, but I did not vote at all in the last election. I just didn't know what else to do. I was put in a state of utter electoral paralysis, and I just watched. So I'm not saying that's a good way to resolve your conflicts when you're a voter, but that's just what happened in 2024 for me. In that I also found it impossible to vote for Trump. It was interesting, both on election day and on inauguration day, emotionally for me, because I was so cheered up. I was so happy.
Yeah.
I'd be the first to admit the guy is erratic, his character is suspect, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing more boring than listening to any Democrat talk about Donald Trump. But his policies are fantastic. And the earlier this week was the inauguration. I watched the whole thing. Usually have very little time for pomp, but didn't mind it. And then the speech was fabulous. And while it's not a very good sign for any country that the president has to get up in front of his people and announce that there are only 2 sexes, male and female, that's you would think we would have progressed beyond that. But all right, considering where we were, that was an important moment, and it was fabulous. And it's like, and that's the end of it. Now we'll see how summary this is, how radically he can erase this stuff. It's got its claws into the culture pretty deeply. But he's not going to have any time for teaching gender theory in kindergarten. I would love to see him legislate on a federal level about gender affirming care. I use the expression sardonically on minors. I would love to see him just make it an absolute ban. This is great. I mean, he may be dangerous in some regards, but on the whole raft of woke stuff, it is really good news. And it's going to be interesting how much this marks a turning point for all kinds of institutions that he doesn't directly influence. Or do the people who believe in this stuff just cling to it more ferociously than ever? And so in blue states, you still have all the same, teaching 5-year-olds they have to decide what sex they are, and the whole thing, and then you just have a complete departure. between Republican and Democratic cultures. But I would, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that this is a point at which the progressive wing of the Democratic Party just summarily loses and gets told, this stuff doesn't wash with the electorate. Nobody wants to obsess about race anymore. We do believe in meritocracy. It's a losing position to constantly be forcing our notion of equity, meaning, equality of results, which is fascistic. I for now anyway, I am going to be optimistic and even excited. How do you feel?
Well, first, let me say that I share some of your embarrassment because I voted for Trudeau as a lifelong lefty. 2015, not last time. Goodness me. I did, and you know what? On the way home, this is before I knew anything about. I was not very political at the time, and on the way home, I said to my husband, "Sure, the guy's an idiot, but how bad can it be?" I actually said those words. And it turns out
Pretty
rather
bad.
Yeah. Yeah. So I understand the
He run
embarrassment.
the country.
Oh, he's just, I mean, he turned us into we're some kind of genocidal nation and we should feel nothing but shame to be Canadian. We had the flags flying at half mast because somebody found, they turned out to just be rocks, but it was supposed to be mass graves. Trudeau's kneeling at the site of the graves that weren't even graves for the residential schools. We got kids missing body parts. We had people who had their bank accounts frozen because they donated to a protest that he didn't like. Things turned out to be really, really bad. Yeah. But the Trump thing, you see, whatever your feelings about Trump, that executive order for our issue, for the gender issue, it was just straight up sanity. It was just reality. It was just stating the most basic facts about human existence in the clearest, plainest language. You can't help, if you're in the gender debate, you can't help but feel optimistic and inspired by that. It was exhilarating to read it.
And he's mandating that official records have to use biological sex. And again, shouldn't have to say that, but I found one of the especially disturbing offshoots of this movement is the changing of birth certificates, which is as if you can go back and change reality. You can change history. You can change biology. And that's demented. And for the record keepers of a society who are mostly concerned with fact, that's what they're for. That's what they're recording is fact. To be recorded, deliberately recording lies and fantasies is catastrophic.
Yeah, it's complete. That's my thing at the moment because Canadian trans activists are very upset because they've got like an X. We allow them to put X's on their passports if they think themselves to be neither male nor female. So they're now wondering what's going to happen when they cross into the US. I don't think it's I think they're just drumming up fear where there's no reason to. But it's if you create a fantasy land, Canada is the fantasy land where you can be sexless or you can change sex just by uttering some kind of magic phrase. When you leave the country, you're going to collide with reality. And that's can't be good for these people to feel threatened when really it's just reality that they're entering.
Well, that is the price of having bought into a cult-like ideology which is in defiance of reality. And how this has gone on so long is the real mystery. How is it that we have allowed ourselves to be convinced that we are, morally and perhaps even legally obliged to cooperate with someone else's fantasy and not call them on it? Now, and I do think that this is the question. How has this lasted so long? I can see it being a little, some summer that everyone gets obsessed with it, and then it's like, let's get a grip. But this has not been a passing fad. This has been a consuming social obsession, and it's across the Western world. It's not just the United States or North America. It's everywhere.
But it's not just trans. It's also like COVID, took a life of its own that I don't think any of us could have predicted. And those masks and, all sorts of, ratting your neighbors out because they went out to the car or whatever the hell. And then there was, critical race theory that just seems to have exploded. So it's not just, I know I agree with everything you're saying about trans, but actually it's bigger and deeper and more
absolutely.
reflective.
And that's the whole, that's the whole Mania motivation. That's why I wrote that book, because I kept seeing it wasn't just trans. It was, as DEI, critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, and COVID certainly. And I was one of the first people in the UK that I know of who said that lockdowns were a terrible idea. I think it was 1 week into the lockdown that I wrote my first column saying this is crazy, and it is not the way you deal with disease, and it is disproportionate, and it's going to have terrible consequences. So, but that wasn't a popular viewpoint at the time. And that phenomenon had a whole constellation of submanias, right? The mania for masks, and people are just crazed about it. I mean, they get into punch-ups. And the mania for the vaccine mandates. And so, of course, and this is even after it's obvious that they don't work. And
yeah,
I found that experience really affected me. I came out the other side of it far more cynical, and
me too,
utterly disgusted with the human race, and utterly disillusioned with so-called liberal democracy. It doesn't work. Apparently, it can be canceled literally overnight.
Yeah.
So what kind of rights are those, really? Oh no, never mind. You can't leave your house. You can't see any of your friends. And you can't go to a restaurant unless you stick this medicine in your arm. And by the way, we haven't done very much research on it. And if you have a bad reaction, we're not going to let you tell anyone, because you're going to be edited off the internet. The whole thing was appalling, and I'm not over it. I don't think I'm ever going to get over it.
Yeah. It showed me, I kind of, over the last few years, I've really seen how, the Cultural Revolution happened, how Stasi Germany happened, how all of those atrocities, I never understood them. And then I saw, 90% of people will roll in with whatever's...
They'll do anything. I came to the conclusion in the UK that it would take for National Socialism, Nazi style, to be adopted in the UK, I think it would take about 3 weeks. That's it. I mean, they're just the same lemmings as everyone else. And in fact, it's funny you should say that, because there's a whole passage in Mania in which the protagonist says exactly that all those, Stalinism and Mao's culturalism and Pol Pot, etc. It always seemed unfathomable, and now they made perfect sense. They were that's what people were like, and they will believe anything. They will, and they'll do what they're told.
The key element seems to be is, if we want to have a resistance, and we need a resistance, is the ability to speak out. That when you can't speak out, you've got a totalitarianism. It's gone violent. And we were frighteningly close to that, because the idea of you, Lionel Shriver, who I knew as very forthright, kind of takes no prisoners, that you were cowed into not speaking about transgenderism until 2016. I think that says a lot, because, and J.K. Rowling taking her time to speak out. These are big figures, like the likes of me and Mia speaking out and getting it in the neck. And I'm not going to, but honestly, I think it's frightening. And people say this is not cancel culture. Cancel culture is ferocious.
Yeah, I think some of the trouble with the language, even like the alliteration of cancel culture, it makes it sound a little bouncy, and it isn't. It's vicious. And the word woke is too cute. It's too useful to abandon, because, as you noted, we're dealing with a package deal of insanity, and that word represents all of it. So we're going to have to keep using it until we've stamped it out.
I've got a quote here from Mania that I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
You say, I don't know who says it. Social hysterias do not stand still. If they're not losing steam, they're getting worse. Where do you think we are now? Are we losing steam, or is it getting worse?
Oh, we're definitely losing steam, I think. Also, you know what? There's a way in which, when you believe something and you say it enough times and maybe do enough podcasts saying the same thing, you make it true. And I want this to be true very badly. So I'm going to claim, anyway, that wokeism is on the back foot and on the way out the door. I think it's over. I think somehow Trump winning the election in November was a fatal blow. And also, I mean, I did a short piece for Spiked Online on this. It was weirdly picked up everywhere.
I saw that,
but I advanced the theory that the people who are susceptible to this progressive package of manias, the wokesters, they're conformists. They didn't make this stuff up. They are susceptible to social fashion. And if we convince them that the woke package is now hopelessly dated and uncool, they'll drop it like a hot rock. So let's say, it's unhip. It's yesterday. It's over, man.
Oh, yeah. I saw you saying, and I thought it was so true, because especially us, kind of the gender critical world, this kind of, we were like, Daddy was in the front seat. We're like, are we there yet? Are we there yet?
Yes.
Has the tide turned yet?
That's right. That's the thing. That whole, have we hit peak, peak woke? And I have been repeatedly asked this in podcasts like this or in events. Is this as bad as it's going to get? Are we on the other side of the hill yet? Please tell us. Please, Stella. And of course, how am I supposed to know?
Do you? Okay,
This is the first time you go ahead, me, but this is the first time I actually think, it's different. People are belligerent now. They're like,
it's totally
feels
different.
massively different to me.
Yeah.
Trump, even in Canada, I'm in Canada, right? Like we still have Trudeau, and there's no obvious sign that the pendulum is swinging, and yet I can still feel it. It is swinging, and we just need a change of government, and then we'll have our Trump moment.
Yep.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. Do you fear an overcorrection? Like that? Okay, I heard you talk in an interview about a reaction that you had watching BBC Hard Talk, and the president or the CEO, whatever, the leader of the WHO, was being interviewed, and you had a reaction that it's a feeling, it's an impulse that I've had. And you explained it really well. Do you know what I'm talking about? She was a black woman and she was being interviewed on Hard Talk. Could you?
Oh, yes. And I immediately assume she's not qualified for the job.
Right. And I find that I have that in me as well.
Yeah. It's a rational reflex. I mean, something like half the judges that Biden appointed were black women. I mean, they're only 7% of the population, an even smaller percentage of the people who have law degrees. It's absurd. So, if I see a black female judge in the United States, why am I going to think she sure knows, knows her stuff? We can, or even be neutral about it. Even say, okay, well, it's a judge, we'll see. No, I just think, yeah. Now, this is, in terms of race relations, totally regressive.
Yes.
I mean, it's tragedy, actually, because some of those black female judges may be entirely competent and smart, and but how are we supposed to know that? Because they weren't chosen because they were smart or qualified or have very good judgment about moral matters. No. And so, this is a huge step backwards. And I've said forever, because the DEI is really it's all about rehashing the affirmative action question in the United States. And that's been going on for 50 years. And I've had an opinion about it for 50 years, which is that I don't like it and that it's destructive. And it's destructive for all parties, including the people it's trying to help, because it implies that you need a leg up. And it destroys other people's faith in your qualifications because you got them under false pretenses. You didn't really earn them. You got help. And I think that's very destructive for minorities themselves. How isn't it a compromised experience to get into Harvard and you're black? And if you know anything, you know that you've been cut all kinds of slack, and you didn't have to get the same scores on the SAT. Surely it means less to get in. Now, on a practical level, I'm sure plenty of such students will go ahead and accept the admission because it would be in their interest. Still, if the prize has been damaged, and so it's not in anyone's interest, this DEI stuff, and I want to get past it. I don't enjoy that reaction that you described, that you remembered. It makes me feel guilty. It makes me feel like a racist. But it also makes me feel like a realist.
The fear is that you recognize it in yourself. I recognize it in myself, and you can fight against that impulse, or you can at least think it through. there will probably be a large number of people who won't recognize it and will just. I think I've heard you say we fought racism with racism and created more racism. That's my fear.
Well, this is the case with a lot of the issues that we've been battling for the last 10 years, is that the positions we've been arguing seem so obvious. They seem like the application of simple rationality and practicality and recognition of how people function, and it's obvious that fighting racism with more racism is going to add rather than subtract evil in the world. It adds more racism. So, I mean, in fact, one of my points of distress about the last 10 or 12 years is I worry that I've wasted a lot of my time on what should be totally obvious questions. That and not just when I'm talking, but what I've chosen to write my books about. I sometimes feel that I have been tempted into addressing questions that shouldn't even be questions, and therefore maybe I'm writing work that will be of no importance because I have been tempted into subject matter that's unworthy of me. And I would say that more broadly about many other people who've been with me on this, that maybe we have allowed a bunch of fucking morons to set the agenda, and therefore they win, or they have been winning, because that's what we have talked about. That is what we put our energies into, both professionally and socially. And that's a little tragedy because it's such a waste. I mean, that's when I was talking about the fact that the whole transgender trend has been a misallocation of resources. My resources have also been misallocated to addressing something that I shouldn't have to, the reality of biological sex. That's absurd. That's an absurd thing to be spending hours, days, years of your life on. And that's one of the things I most resent.
That's a great pity to me, because I was hoping to convince you to write a book about the parent of a trans-identified kid.
I've thought about it. I've actually wondered whether the moment has passed.
It would be such a gift. It would be such a gift if you did, because it would get it into the mainstream. I've been watching so carefully the whole grooming gangs, the Muslim, Pakistani grooming gangs in England, and what's gone down there, and how hard it was. Even though they had inquiries, they had men go to jail, they had people speaking out, and yet still it didn't go into the public consciousness. There was something about it. It didn't get in. So if you did write a book like that, it would get into the public consciousness, the concept of when you've got a child and they're vulnerable and they've lost themselves, and you bring them to professionals, and those professionals, as one parent very evocatively said to me, it was like being in a horror movie, and the doctor, the good guy, suddenly turned away and took off his mask, and he was the monster who was going to get my child. You know what I mean? It's such a vulnerable position those parents have been in.
Oh, my heart goes out to the parents. They're some of the most sympathetic victims in this whole scenario.
Yeah,
and
yeah, they.
And I mean, I'm less sympathetic, of course, with the parents who really got into it obviously, having a trans kid has for some time now conferred a lot of social status, and I think there are plenty of parents who've enjoyed it and basked in it. But
Well, I could
the
introduce
other parents, I so feel sorry for them.
devastating. Devastating. Could I just ask, we're coming up towards the end, unless you have another question, Mia, one thing I'd love to hear you is how you see it pan out. I think the overcorrection is something we need to worry about. Likely us three will be talking about the overcorrection on the other side in a year or two. You know what I mean? So I do think the overcorrection is something that we should worry about. But how do you see the next few years pan out on the presumption that we've reached peak woke?
I'm not that nervous about an overcorrection. I don't think we're going back to Jim Crow. I don't think we're going back to a time that that somehow the answer to the transgender thing is to say no. We have very rigid sex roles, and you just all the girls have to wear dresses, and they just can't swap clothes. I don't see what would happen other than saying we're not going to mangle children anymore, and we're not going to promote this stuff. How would you overcorrect in that sense?
My fear with the overcorrection, and this may, after my comment about the lesbians in the 1990s, might seem a bit odd, but my fear is the trans rights movement, if we're talking specifically trans, that it's just done so much damage. You can't, as you say, mangle children's bodies in the name of trans rights and expect the trans community to emerge from it unscathed, their reputation unscathed. And transgender people are very visible, particularly the men. And I do fear, like the, fight racism with racism and you end up with more racism, that perhaps there's going to be a really strong backlash against visibly trans-identified people. And I don't know how you stop that.
I think the danger, and I'm thinking especially the United States right now because it's so polarized, is that you martyr trans people and you turn this movement, rather than being so much proselytizing, as paranoid and this is, if, for example, Trump were to pass a law against gender-affirming care for minors, you can be sure there would be a huge backlash among the kind of parents I was talking about, and the so-called trans community itself. They'd be persecuted, and this is a terrible civil rights issue, and this is
Genocide.
Yeah, it's a genocide, because to deny that their fantasy is supposedly tantamount to murder, as I understand it. So this is threatening trans lives. I can see that. I mean, the rhetoric is already dialed up to 10, but I can see it getting even worse. And I think that's the danger, more than over conservatism on this issue.
Mm-hmm. We'll see.
I mean, on the Trump agenda, I'm especially worried about the immigration thing, because, like most Americans, I would like to see the U.S. get control of the border and have a rational immigration policy. But it's not going to take much if he follows through on the deportations to turn this into a very emotive and again, paranoid, poor persecuted people who broke the law, but they're part of our country now. We need them, and it could get really sappy and make immigration enforcement harder. I guess that's my concern.
My last question is, I also heard you once say that you found something of a niche in fiction, in that you were willing to write about things that other people were not willing to write about, and there's a huge market for it. Do you see a point coming, like I think I sense it, where it's going to actually be rather lucrative to have taken a stand against this? I think about Graham Linehan and all the price that he's paid, and all of the people cancelled. Very soon we're going to see that they were right. They were on the right side. They took a stand and they were courageous and brave. Do you think that there's a shift coming there, that it may actually, the people who lost a lot may suddenly be propelled to success again?
No, I don't think so. The conversation will simply move on, and that means that people like Graham or me, who stuck their necks out, are still figures from a previous era, and it's not going to necessarily pay off financially or professionally. In fact, if not anything else, it will be a disadvantage because it pins you to a time that is over. Right? So you stood up, you're associated with something that's already in the past, and we don't want to talk about it anymore. Besides which, once this stuff is over, then you're going to have all these people who are on, as they like to say, the wrong side of history, right? And who wants to think about that? Who wants to think about having been wrong? So if we really do turn the page, then Graham and I are just relics of an earlier era. So I think that's one of the frustrating things about the whole mania phenomenon, is that I don't often see people rewarded for having maintained their independence and having said, sorry, get a grip, please, this is wrong. It doesn't happen very often. A contrary example, I was gratified to see Jay Bhattacharya appointed to the head of the National Institutes of Health. He was behind the what's it called? The what?
Oh, I can't remember. I know what you mean.
I just blanked on it.
Can't remember.
Yeah. Anyway, he stuck his neck out onto COVID. He was right, and he's being rewarded. So that's a good example.
Jay who I was thinking of. It was Bhattacharya that in my mind, and then I was thinking of Graham and all the people that stood up for what was right. Is the pendulum swing going to be such that they will be rewarded in some way? But I guess you're right, because I was obsessed with multiple personality disorder and the satanic panic for a long time. And you're right, once that was over, it was so embarrassing that everyone involved just like, let's just file that away. Let's just never talk about that again.
Forgotten about that.
Because they swept it under the carpet. Yeah. They were so embarrassed by it. It was such a shameful moment. So just don't talk about it. And that's true. Then the heroes don't get any recognition.
I mean, is Graham ever going to see Father Ted the musical? I'm not so sure.
He doesn't think so. But he does have a new sitcom with Andrew Doyle, sorry.
Yeah.
They're filming something in the US. There's a whole new something coming.
Yeah, I gather.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I'm happy for him.
And we'll finish on this. There does seem to be a resistance, an intellectual resistance that has bound each other.
Yes.
And I do, yeah, I think we can safely say, come the next COVID, come the next, that we kind of know each other now, and there's a lot of contacts have been made.
Yeah.
I think we're stronger now than we were.
I
some
agree.
years ago.
And, you know, that's the other side of the cynicism that I came out of COVID with. Especially if I enlarge the lens and include the last decade, I have been really pleased to discover a host of people who have been courageous and have said what they think, regardless of the implications for them personally, who do think for themselves, who have really endangered themselves in order to stick up for the truth. And I'm proud to know any number of them. And it makes me feel less lonely and more optimistic that the human race is not lost. And, you know, a number of them are women who have distinguished themselves on the transgenderism issue. You know, Helen Joyce, Maya Forstetter, J.K. Rowling, Kathleen Stott.
Yeah.
I mean, they've risked everything, and I am in awe of them. Those were the people who really broke the taboo on saying anything negative about the trans phenomenon, and changed the landscape and made it more possible for us to talk about.
Yeah,
definitely.
I think that's a lovely place to end it, don't you, Stella?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lionel.
Thank you, Lionel.
Oh, it's been a joy.